Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about 2 Corinthians. You may remember in a previous video I spoke about 1 Corinthians and talked a fair amount about the background from elsewhere in the scriptures and something of the relationship between Paul, the apostle, and this church in Corinth. I'm certainly not going to repeat all that here, but what I do want to talk about is one extra feature of the relationship between Paul and the Corinthian church, which may and probably does have some impact on how we read this letter. I'm talking about the ancient Roman system of patronage. Now, before I talk about that, I want to just issue one brief caveat here. It's never obvious to me how much we should take into account the extra-biblical background, or what we think is extra-biblical background, of ancient texts like 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians when we're interpreting these texts. Personally, I always feel more comfortable if I can find clues in the text itself about what aspects of the background are significant. And I feel a little bit uncertain when people have these extremely elaborate reconstructions of what the ancient world was like, and then they draw extremely far-reaching implications for every single verse in the text, and it radically overturns what you thought it meant previously. It doesn't seem to me that that's such a secure way to proceed. We hardly know what's going on in our own world right now. How much harder is it for us to reconstruct what was happening 2,000 years ago with that kind of precision? But in this case, I do think there is something to be said for taking into account something of this extra biblical background for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because what I'm going to be giving you, at least in this video, is not a particularly detailed account at all, and therefore it's not really particularly speculative. What I'm saying is just broad brush. It's a little bit like in 1,000 years' time if somebody said there were two major parties in America in the 21st century, the Democrats and the Republicans. You know, whatever you thought about the nuances, that's true. Well, it's certainly true that in the ancient Roman Empire there was a patronage system in operation, and we know roughly how it operated. But the second reason why I think it might be significant is that there are clues in the letter itself, and it makes sense and chimes with, cuts with the grain of a lot of the letter itself, and I'll show you that in a minute or two when I've described what this system was. I know you may have come across it before, so apologies if I'm telling you what you already know, but the ancient Roman system of patronage worked a little bit like this. The society in ancient Rome was extremely hierarchical. You've got the emperor at the top, and then a whole bunch of other officials with various roles and various positions in society, whether through their wealth or their political positions or their professions, which gave them status in the society. And the status was indicated by the kind of clothes you wore and so on, and the kind of house you lived in and so on. So you've got this hierarchical society in which you've got wealthy, high status people at the top, and then down to less wealthy, lower status people towards the bottom, and slaves right at the very bottom. Now, it was important in the ancient Roman Empire for people with higher status to display their status. They wanted to make their status known to the world. And the way they did this was through the system of patronage. A wealthy, high-status person would become a patron to one or two, or potentially a very large number of lower-status people, their clients. Patron, client. And basically the patron would pay the client for favours or public displays of honour or something like that. Let me give you some examples. I mean, the one common one, it seems, was that the clients of some patrons would all assemble outside the house of the patron first thing in the morning to greet them formally in a somewhat elaborate way. In the afternoon, they'd walk behind them as a kind of extended entourage, all dressed in their slightly more lowly costumes and clothing, to follow the wealthy patron as he went for his afternoon bath or something. And the length of your entourage symbolised your status, you see. So if you had a great pile of clients, you could display your immense status in that way by having all these people parading behind you. If you were particularly wealthy, you might have a kind of a small or maybe medium or large-sized private army as basically your clients. You could pay a builder who's building a house to put your crest or some kind of your name engraved in the structure of the house if he was your client. You could pay a poet to be your client, and the poet would compose and recite poems in public in your honour. And importantly, for 2 Corinthians, writers and public speakers could be the clients of their wealthy patrons, and what they would then do was they would give speeches and tell amusing anecdotes in which the patron was the hero of every story. And this was a fairly significant part of entertainment in the ancient world. People couldn't go to Chick-fil-A or go to the movies, and so they had to do something. And so one of the things they would do would be go and listen to the speeches of the great orators, who would, of course, extol the virtues of their wealthy patrons. You find ancient speeches written in honour of Roman emperors in this kind of context. Right, so that's the system of patronage as it existed in the ancient world and as it existed in Corinth. And Paul despised it. He absolutely rejected it. Because what it basically did was it placed people in society in the service of those above them in a way that conflicted with their service of Christ. And it also placed people who are higher up in society in this kind of position of assumed self-importance over those who are lower. There'd be no way, for example, that somebody wealthy would eat with a slave. But of course, we already know from 1 Corinthians that Paul insists that everybody gets to eat this meal together. Wait for each other. You don't have the wealthy people with their bucket load of wine before all the poor people come in. This meal we eat together. And so Paul attacked this system of patronage because of the social divisions it caused, and also because some of its practical consequences meant, of course, that a public speaker who was a client would have to speak in honour of the patron. He would be a trained rhetor or rhetorician, somebody skilled in giving amusing and witty speeches, and who spoke with a certain artistic flair to amuse and entertain rather than particularly to inform. And he would be expected to do this in the service of his patron. And it seems that Paul got on the nerves of some of the people in Corinth because he refused, basically, to be their client. And what he actually did was to make himself low, to make himself a servant, and thus to degrade himself actually in the eyes of the wealthy patronage types in Corinth, who would look down on somebody who'd do the work of a servant or the work of a slave. But in this, Paul was doing what Christ did, and this is really the key point. Sorry to be 7 minutes in before we get to the key point of saying all this. The purpose of Paul rejecting this system of patronage was to point out that all of us are in service as slaves to a greater master. And that ought to inform and shape all that we do. And as you look at 2 Corinthians, what you start to see is that Paul was always in this letter highlighting how he had rejected this system and was seeking simply to serve the people in Corinth. Briefly, let's have a look at these. He highlights in chapter 1 his sufferings. Exactly what a patron would not expect his client to do, and certainly not what a wealthy patron would expect to experience. But he highlights this as a great and wonderful thing. We're sharing in Christ's sufferings for the sake of the church. In chapter 3, he rejects the idea of needing letters of recommendation like a client might do if he was seeking employment or sponsorship from a wealthy patron. He says, "You're our letter. You're the proof that the Spirit of God is at work." And of course, speaking of the Spirit of God, that's the subject of the rest of chapter 3. Chapter 4, when he describes his ministry, he's contrasting it with the standard modes of speech that were employed by the clients who were professional speakers, rhetoricians, performers on the public stages. He says, we've renounced all these deceptive, underhanded ways, all these ways of manipulating people. We just preach the truth plainly. And even if our gospel is veiled, then it's only veiled to those who are perishing anyway. Those whom the Lord has called are being drawn to him. He highlights and draws attention again and again and again to his weakness. Chapter 4, death is at work in us. but life in you. Chapter 5, we have this tent in which we groan. Chapter 6, afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, labours, sleepless nights, hunger, and so on and so forth. What he's doing, can you see, he's highlighting how I just don't care about your system of patronage. Look how ashamed, look how weak, look how empty, look how much of nothing I am. And this is what Christ became. And as he's doing this, he's constantly trying to show them how to shape their lives so that their lives reflect the Lord Jesus Christ. Of course, that then makes sense of chapters 8 and 9, where he's saying, listen, you guys who are so wealthy, actually you could do something intelligent with your money, because there's some people starving to death in Jerusalem, and even the poor Christians in Macedonia gave out of their poverty to alleviate some of their hunger. So why don't you do the same? And then chapter 10, again, he's defending his ministry. In this case, chapter 10, verse 10, against some people who say that his bodily presence is weak and of no account. Because, of course, he refused to speak in the patterns of the trained rhetors, the trained speakers. He just came and preached the gospel to them, which itself was powerful, but it was powerful in its own way. Then again, chapter 11, chapter 12, he goes on and on and on about his sufferings, because what he's trying to highlight, and this is the key for the whole of this letter, is that the path of faithfulness is a path of faithful suffering, faithful Christ-like suffering. It's not a path of trying to be the client of somebody wealthy and to impress him by doing him favours, and it's not the path of trying to buy the favours of somebody whom you consider beneath you. And so it is that Paul attacks this system of patronage in 2 Corinthians. Hope that's helpful and insightful as you try and dig into this letter. The Lord bless you, and I hope very much to see you soon. Bye for now.